I fired her on a Friday afternoon, standing in the doorway of my own office with a termination letter I'd typed up myself. And I did it fast, on purpose, because I didn't want to give either one of us room to talk it out. I told Lynn Tran her position was being eliminated, effective that day, and she looked at me for a second, nodded once, and started clearing out her desk without a word of argument. I picked her first, out of 26 people, because she was the quietest one on my floor, and some part of me had already decided that quiet people don't put up a fight, and don't leave much of a hole behind them. By Monday morning, I understood exactly how wrong that was, and it wasn't a slow realization. It hit me before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. My name's Carol Jessup. I'm 57 years old. I run a commercial print and signage shop here in Toledo, Ohio, called Jessup Print and Sign, and I've been running it, building it, really, brick by brick, for 26 years. We do large format signage, screen printing, retail and hospital wayfinding, the kind of work you don't think about until you're standing in a hospital hallway looking for radiology and somebody's sign told you which way to turn. I've got 26 employees on payroll as of the week I'm telling you about, though that number was about to move. And I've got one son, Tommy, 29, who runs day-to-day operations under me and is going to inherit this place whether he thinks he's ready for it or not. I'm going to tell this the way it happened, start to finish, because if I jump around you, you'll end up giving me credit I hadn't earned yet at the point in the story where you're hearing it. I should tell you first how I built this place, because the way I built it is the same soil that grew the mistake I made. I started Jessup Print and Sign with my ex-husband Ray in a rented bay off Airport Highway, back when I was 31, 2 years out of a bookkeeping job I hated, with $11,000 we'd scraped together and a used 4-color press we bought off a shop that was liquidating. Ray was the one with the printing background. He'd apprenticed under his uncle, and I was the one who could read a balance sheet and wasn't afraid to call a client and ask where our money was. We built that business, the two of us, loud, both of us, the kind of loud that gets things done. Ray hollering across the shop floor about a job running behind, me on the phone browbeating a paper supplier into a better rate. That was how things got done in my world. You wanted something, you said so, loudly and often, until somebody moved. I built a whole philosophy of business off that instinct without ever once examining it. The same way you don't examine the water you learn to swim in. In my head, for 20-some years, the employees who mattered were the ones I heard from. The ones who spoke up in a production meeting, who came to me with a complaint, who made themselves known. And the ones I didn't hear much from, I filed away, without meaning to, as employees who probably didn't have much going on upstairs, or didn't care enough to say so if they did. I want to be plain about that, because it's the root of everything that comes after. I equated a person's volume with a person's value for over 2 decades, and I never once stopped to ask whether that was a fair way to measure a human being, or just a fair way to measure people who happened to be built the way I was built. Ray and I split up 15 years ago, a story for another day, nothing dramatic, just 2 people who'd grown apart faster than the business had grown, and I kept the shop in the divorce, kept the name, kept building. Tommy came up working the floor same as I had, sweeping up vinyl scraps as a kid, running a squeegee by the time he was 16. And by the time this story starts, he was my operations manager, 29 years old, quieter than me by a good margin, which used to worry me some, if I'm honest, before it turned out to be one of his better qualities. Lynn Tran had been with me 11 years by the time I fired her. She came to Jessup Print and Sign the same year we picked up our first hospital signage contract, hired on originally to help with order entry and basic scheduling. And over those 11 years she'd worked her way, quietly, without ever once asking me for the title change that should have come with it. Into the role of production scheduler and lead estimator, the person who took a client's raw order and turned it into a shop floor sequence, vendor purchase orders, and a delivery date we could actually hit. I want to tell you plainly what I thought of her, because softening it wouldn't do either of us any good in this telling. I thought of Lynn as a capable, quiet woman who kept her head down, did her job, never caused trouble, and I assumed, without ever once testing the assumption, that the reason she never caused trouble was that she didn't have much reason to. I assumed her quiet was the quiet of someone who understood her place, who was grateful for steady work and wasn't going to make waves about a raise or a title or credit for anything. Because in my head, without my ever saying it out loud even to myself, that's what quiet Vietnamese women who spoke English carefully and never raised their voice in a meeting were supposed to be like. I thought her reserve meant she had less riding on this job than my louder employees did, less skill worth protecting, less to lose. I was going to find out how completely, how catastrophically, I had that backwards. And I want you to sit with the fact that I'm not telling you that to build suspense. I'm telling you because it's the exact shape of what I got wrong, and I don't want you missing it in the noise of everything that comes next. The layoffs came out of a bad spring. We'd lost a regional grocery chain's signage contract to a competitor out of Columbus, who'd undercut us by nearly 20% on a bid I still believe we should have won on quality alone, and losing that account took a chunk out of revenue I hadn't built enough cushion to absorb without cutting somewhere. I sat down with my accountant, a sharp man named Phil Osai, who'd kept my books straight for going on 15 years, and Phil laid it out plain. I needed to cut payroll by roughly the equivalent of 3 full-time positions, and I needed to do it fast, before the summer slow season made the hole any deeper. I didn't want to do it. I want that understood, because none of what follows makes sense if you think I went into that Friday looking to hurt anybody. I'd never laid off a soul in 26 years running that shop, prided myself on it, the way my father used to pride himself on never having to lay off a man at the plant he foremaned for 30 years. But a business that doesn't survive doesn't keep anybody employed. And I understood that math same as anybody who's run a company through a hard stretch understands it. The question was who. I sat with that decision alone in my office on a Thursday night, going down a list of 26 names, and I want to tell you exactly what my thinking was, because I've turned it over enough times since to know it cold. I wasn't looking purely at output. If I had been, I'd have caught what I missed. I was looking, without fully admitting it to myself, at who I'd noticed being gone. Who filled a room. Who I heard from in a Monday production meeting. Who pushed back when I made a call they disagreed with. Who I could picture, in my head, standing in my office arguing their case if I told them their job was cut. I ran through the list and I kept landing, without quite deciding to, on the quiet ones. Figuring, I suppose, that quiet on the way in probably meant quiet on the way out. And quiet on the way out felt, to a woman trying to get through a hard week with as little noise as possible, like the path of least resistance. Lynn's name came up early in that list, and I remember exactly the thought that put her there. I thought, she does scheduling, mostly clerical, keeps to herself, never says much in meetings, doesn't seem the type to make a fuss. I thought her job, the actual content of what she did all day, was smaller and simpler than it was, because I'd never once sat down and actually mapped out, in detail, everything that passed through her hands before it hit my shop floor. I'd watched her for 11 years do her job so smoothly, so without visible friction, that I'd mistaken the smoothness for simplicity. I thought, if I'm honest, that a job done that quietly couldn't be doing that much. Tommy pushed back on it, and I dismissed him, and I want to tell that part straight because it's not flattering to me at all. We were in my office Thursday night, going through the list together, since he ran day to day, and I wanted his read on who we could operationally afford to lose. And when I got to Linna's name, he sat forward and said, "Ma, no, not Lynn. You cut Lynn. You're cutting the person who actually knows how every job in this building fits together. She's not just entering orders, she's sequencing the floor. She's the one who catches it when two big jobs are going to collide on the same press week. I don't know how you replace that with anybody else on staff." "She's a scheduler, Tommy," I said. "I can teach scheduling to somebody in a month. I can't teach somebody to run a press in a month. That's why the press operators stay. This isn't personal, it's math." "It's not just scheduling," he said, and I could hear him getting more insistent, which for Tommy was saying something. Because he wasn't built loud like me. "She's been quietly running half the operational logic of this place for years, and nobody's noticed, because she doesn't make noise about it." "That's not nothing, Ma. That's the opposite of nothing." "I hear you," I said, which is a thing I said back then, when I had no intention of actually changing course. And I want to own that plainly. I said the words that sound like I was listening, and I wasn't. Not really. I had it in my head already, and Tommy's pushback registered to me, in the moment, as a young man being soft-hearted about somebody he liked, not as him seeing something true about the operation that I'd missed. I told myself I knew the business better than he did, 26 years to his 3 as operations manager, and I let that seniority do the thinking a closer look should have done instead. I made the calls Friday morning, 3 of them, and Linna's was the first, and I did it fast and clean the way I've already told you, and she cleared her desk in under 20 minutes and left, without asking me a single question about why. Which, at the time, I read as confirmation I'd read her right. A quiet woman, taking a hard thing quietly, no fight in her, and which I understand now, with everything I know today, was something else entirely. It was a woman who understood, faster than I did, exactly what not asking me questions was going to cost me, and who let me find that out on my own, in my own time, without the dignity of a warning. The crack showed up before I'd even finished my coffee Monday morning, which I told you already, and I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, hour by hour, because the speed of it is the part that still gets me. I came in at 7, same as always, and the shop floor was already off. Not chaotic exactly, not yet, but off. The particular quiet of a building where something's wrong, and nobody said so out loud yet. Our lead press operator, a big steady man named Frank Okafor, who'd been with me 19 years, caught me in the hallway before I even got my coat off, and said, "Carol, we've got a problem." The Henderson job and the county wayfinding job both got scheduled onto Press 2 for the same window, Wednesday. Somebody's got to bump, and I don't know which one, and I don't know who normally makes that call. I said, "Lynn makes that call," before I remembered. And then I remembered, and I felt something drop in my stomach that I didn't have time to sit with because the phone in my office was already ringing. It was Denise Malloy from Mercy St. Vincent, the hospital system that made up almost a third of our annual revenue between their wayfinding contracts and their ongoing directory sign updates. She was not happy. A batch of directional signage for a new wing opening was supposed to have shipped Friday for a Monday install, and it hadn't shipped because, and I didn't know this yet, wouldn't know it for another hour. The vendor purchase order for the substrate material had never gone out. Lynn handled vendor purchase orders. Lynn had been let go Friday afternoon, mid-cycle. In the middle of a production run, she'd been the only person tracking start to finish. I told Denise I'd call her back within the hour with an answer, and I hung up and I went and found Tommy, And I said, "Walk me through everything Lynn actually did. All of it. Don't spare me." He didn't spare me. Turned out, Lynn wasn't just entering orders into a calendar, the way I'd pictured it in my head for 11 years. She was running the entire production logic of that shop, taking every incoming order, cross-referencing it against machine capacity, current job backlog, material lead times from 4 different vendors, and client-specific deadline requirements, and building, essentially by hand, in a system she'd developed herself over the years. A running sequence that kept jobs from colliding, kept us from overpromising delivery dates we couldn't hit, and kept material orders going out with enough lead time that we never ran a press dry waiting on substrate. She'd built that whole system without ever once asking for a title bump to match it, without ever once making it a point of pride in a staff meeting. Because Tommy told me this part, and it's the part that sat heaviest. Lynn had told him once, years back, in passing, that she'd rather the work speak for her than have to speak for the work herself. On account of some early years in this country where speaking up loudly hadn't gotten her anywhere but noticed in ways she didn't want to be noticed. By 10 that morning we'd found 2 more problems, a second vendor order that hadn't gone out, and a scheduling conflict on a 3rd job nobody but Lynn had been tracking closely enough to catch before it became a crisis instead of a Tuesday afternoon. By 11, Frank Okafor, my lead press operator, the closest thing I had to a shop floor elder statesman, came into my office and shut the door, which he never did, and sat down across from me without being asked, which he also never did, and said, "Carol, I need to say something and I need you to actually hear it this time, not just let it pass through you." I said, "All right. You picked Lynn first because she's quiet," he said. "I watched you build that list Thursday night. I could see it on your face even before Tommy told me how the conversation went. You picked the ones who wouldn't make a scene about it. And I want to tell you something you don't know, because Lynn would never tell you herself, not in 100 years. And I don't think it's my place to tell you either, except that I think you need to hear it today, right now, before you make another decision this week." He was quiet a second, like he was deciding whether he actually had the right to say what came next, and then he said it anyway. Lynn's father was an engineer back in Vietnam before the war ended things for his career over here. Man never got his credentials recognized in this country. Worked in a machine shop the rest of his life, doing work way under what he was trained for, and he raised Lynn telling her the whole time that being right and being loud were 2 different things, and only one of them actually mattered. "She's been quiet her whole life on purpose, Carol. It's not because she's got nothing going on. It's because somebody taught her, young, that quiet was safer and smarter, and she spent 11 years here proving him right, doing more real thinking for this company than half the people who talk the most in your Monday meetings, and getting less credit for every bit of it. She's got a husband on disability, 2 kids, one of them starting college in the fall, and she is, without one single ounce of drama about it, the most load-bearing person on this floor, and you cut her first because she never once made you notice." I didn't say anything for a while after Frank said that. I want to be honest about what that silence was, because it wasn't me composing a response. It was me sitting there with something true landing on me that I didn't have any ready place to put. The kind of true that makes you go still instead of talk. I remember I had a pen in my hand, and I remember I set it down, careful, like it might make a noise if I didn't. And I remember Frank watching me not say anything, and not filling the silence either, letting me sit in it, which I understood even in the moment was its own kind of mercy he didn't owe me. "Okay," I said, finally, which wasn't much of anything, and Frank nodded once and got up and left my office, and I sat there a long while after he'd gone, looking at that closed door, before I picked the pen back up and made myself get to work on the mess Monday morning had turned into. I want to name it plain, the way I've tried to name everything else plain in this telling, because it does nobody any good if I dress it up softer than it was. What I assumed about Lynn Tran over 11 years was that her quiet meant small stakes in her own job, small skill behind what she did, small cost if I let her go. I built that assumption out of two things braided together, and I've had a long while now to pull them apart and look at each one honestly. The first was my own upbringing, loud people getting things done, quiet people getting stepped past, a lesson I absorbed on my father's shop floor and never once questioned in 50-some years of carrying it. The second, and this is the part I have to say straight without hiding behind the first one, was that Lynn was a Vietnamese woman who spoke carefully, in a measured, accented English, who never raised her voice in a meeting, who deferred rather than argued when a decision went against her, and some old, ugly, unexamined part of me read all of that as confirmation of what I already believed, instead of ever once stopping to ask whether a person's manner has anything at all to do with what's actually inside their head. I looked at a woman being careful with her words, and I decided, without evidence, that she didn't have much worth saying. That's the assumption. I'm not going to call it a snap judgment and leave it soft like that. It was a judgment built on the specific, ugly logic that quiet women, and quiet Asian women most particular, don't need defending because they won't put up the fight to require it, and I carried that logic around for years thinking it was just good management instinct, and it wasn't instinct. It was prejudice wearing a foreman's cap, and I want to say the other part just as plain, because the instructions I'd give myself if I were telling somebody else how to tell this story would insist on it. I was wrong the moment I let her go, not the moment I found out, 3 hours later, how much the shop actually needed her. If Lynn Tran really had been exactly what I'd pictured, a woman doing simple clerical work, replaceable inside a month, nothing riding under the surface, I'd have still been wrong to cut her first, for the reason I cut her, which was that she was quiet and wouldn't make a scene. That's not a management principle. That's cowardice dressed up as one, picking the person least likely to make you uncomfortable about a hard decision, instead of picking based on what the business actually needed. The revelation about everything she was carrying didn't create the wrongness. It just made it impossible for me to keep hiding from it. I called her that Monday afternoon, once Frank had left my office, and I'd sat with it long enough to know I wasn't going to feel any more ready by waiting. I didn't want to do it over the phone, but I also didn't think I had the right to ask her to come back into a building she'd been walked out of 3 days before, so I asked if I could come to her, and she said, after a pause, I could feel, even through the line, that I could come by that evening, 6 o'clock, and that was all she said. She lived in a modest ranch house on the west side, tidy yard, a wheelchair ramp built along the porch steps that I understood now belonged to her husband. And she answered the door in the same careful, composed way she did everything, and she didn't invite me past the front hall, which I understood was its own answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. Lynn, I said, I owe you an apology. And I want to say it plain, not dress it up. I let you go first because you were quiet, and I told myself that meant your job was small and you wouldn't put up a fight about losing it. Both of those things were wrong. Your job wasn't small. I know that now. I should have known it before. And I want to be clear, I'm not apologizing because it turned out you were running half my production floor. I'd owe you this same apology if you'd really been exactly what I assumed you were. I picked you because you're quiet, and I decided quiet meant I could get away with it easier. That's a judgment about you I had no right to make, and I made it anyway. And it cost you 11 years of loyalty getting repaid with 20 minutes and a cardboard box. She stood there a moment, arms folded, Not unkind, but not warm either. And when she spoke, her voice was even, the same careful voice I'd heard in 100 Monday meetings without ever once understanding what was underneath it. "I appreciate you coming here to say that instead of calling," she said. "That matters to me, that you didn't do it over the phone." She paused. "But I want you to understand something, Carol. I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who mistook my not arguing for not having anything to argue with. My father taught me that lesson before I was 10 years old, and I've watched it prove true more times than I can count, at this job and outside it. I'm not surprised you did what you did. I'm disappointed, because 11 years felt like it should have counted for something, and it didn't, not when it mattered. I don't know yet what I want to do with your apology. I've got a husband on disability and a daughter starting college in September, and I don't have the luxury of deciding how I feel about this on your timeline. I need to know what you're actually offering, not just what you're sorry about, before I can tell you whether any of this is going to mean something, or whether it's just going to be words in my front hallway." I said I understood, and I meant it, and I told her I wasn't there to ask her forgiveness that night. I told her I was there to say the thing plain first, and that whatever came after. If anything came after, I understood she got to decide the pace of it, not me. I went home that night and didn't sleep much, and the next morning I sat down with Tommy and Phil Osai, my accountant, and I told them both I wanted to fix this properly, not with an apology alone, because an apology by itself has never meant much in my family. My father used to say, "Sorry's a word you say so you can stop carrying a thing, and it doesn't put anything back in anybody else's pocket." I wanted to know what putting it back would actually look like. First thing I did was offer Lynn her job back, full salary restored, no gap in seniority, and I want to be specific about what that job became, because just handing her the old title back wouldn't have covered what I'd actually learned that week. I sat down with Tommy and mapped out, on paper, everything Frank had described to me. The vendor coordination, the machine capacity sequencing, the deadline cross-referencing she'd been doing by hand for years, and I created a real title around it. Production Planning Manager, with a salary that matched what that role actually was, not what I'd been quietly underpaying her for doing it under a job title that undersold her for a decade. I backdated her seniority straight through, no gap, benefits restored without a lapse, and I put it all on paper before I ever brought it to her. Because I'd learned enough by then to know that showing up with a real offer meant more than showing up with a plan to negotiate one. Second thing, and this one cost me more in front of my own people than the first one cost me in dollars, I called a floor meeting, same as I'd have called for any operational announcement, all 26 of my remaining staff, and I told them straight what I'd done and why. No softer than I've told it to you. I said I picked Lynn Tran first because she was quiet, and I assumed quiet meant small, and I was wrong about that before I ever found out how wrong, and I wanted every person in that room to understand that assumption was mine to own, not anybody else's to make excuses for. I watched Frank's face while I said it, and I watched Tommy's, standing off to the side, and I watched the faces of some of the louder ones on my floor too, the ones who talk in every meeting. And I hoped, without saying it out loud, that some of them heard themselves in what I was describing and thought a little harder about who they talked over without meaning to. Third thing took longer, and it wasn't one action, it was a stretch of months. I asked Lynn, once she'd had time to think it over. I gave her 2 full weeks before I asked her anything at all, because I understood by then that a decision that size wasn't mine to rush, whether she'd take the restored position. And she said she'd think about it further, and I let her think. And 3 weeks after that, she came back. Not because I'd convinced her of anything with words, but because Frank told me later she'd talked it through with her husband and decided the work itself, the actual content of the job, was work she was good at and work she wanted to keep doing, and that she wasn't going to let one bad week take that away from her on top of everything else it had already tried to take. She came back guarded, and she stayed guarded a good long while, and I want to be honest that I don't think that guardedness ever fully left, not in the year and a half since, and I don't think it should have. I didn't get warmth back from her, not in any hurry, and I stopped expecting it, because I understood, clearer the longer I sat with it, that warmth wasn't owed to me for doing the bare minimum of undoing my own mistake. What I got, slowly, over months, was something steadier and I think more honest than warmth, a working trust, built the same way she'd built her whole reputation in that building, quietly, through consistent action rather than declared feeling. I made sure her name went on client-facing documents where her work was the work being praised. I made sure, in production meetings, that when a scheduling call got made, I said out loud, in front of the room, that it was her call to make, not mine to second guess. Small things, most of them, none of them grand. All of them the kind of thing that either happens consistently over a long stretch of time or doesn't mean anything at all. There was an afternoon, maybe 8 months on, when Denise Malloy from Mercy St. Vincent came by the shop for a walkthrough on a new contract, and in the middle of the meeting she asked, direct, who'd been managing the production timeline that had kept every single hospital job on schedule that whole year without a single missed date, and I said, Lynn Tran, our production planning manager. She's the one you want to talk to about that, and I watched Lynn, standing at the edge of that meeting, take that in without much visible reaction at all. No smile, no soft moment. Just a small, even nod, like a fact being correctly recorded at last. Which I understood by then was about as much acknowledgement as she was ever going to let herself show me, and I'd stopped needing more than that. I don't have a clean bow for this one either, and I don't think Lynn would want me putting one on it even if I tried. I picked the quietest person on my floor to fire first, because I'd spent 50-some years believing that quiet meant small, and it took losing 3 vendor orders and a hospital contract in one Monday morning to teach me that quiet just means quiet. It doesn't mean simple, and it doesn't mean less, and it sure as hell doesn't mean somebody's not going to notice, deep down, exactly how little you thought of them, even if they never once raised their voice to tell you so. I was wrong the day I let her go, not the day I found out what she'd been carrying. I want that to be the thing that sticks. More than anything else in this story, don't wait to find out somebody's indispensable before you treat them like they matter. They already do. Mine just had the good sense, and the bad luck, to prove it to me the hard way. If this one hit you the way it hit me telling it, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, hard-earned stories.